a real pleasure to welcome Patricia Callaghan to our speaker series. Patricia is a Carleton Professor of Civil Engineering at Columbia University, where she's in the Earth Institute, and in fact is on the steering committee there. She's had a very interesting route through academia. She started out as an engineer, getting her Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering at the University of Leeds, then went on to Cambridge, where she got her MPhil and PhD in 1989, and actually worked on basically nuclear waste disposal and settlements. And then spent 9 years at MIT. In 2003, Columbia managed to lure her away. And she's been at the Earth Institute ever since. She got interested also in sort of some of the topics she's going to talk about today, basically the urban environment. In fact, she has been co-directing the Urban Design Lab at Columbia with Richard Klaus and most recently also became the founding co-director of the Institute for Data Sciences and Engineering. And so today she will tell us a little bit about her exploration, I think in adaptation and in architecture, and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Weber, and thank you so much for the opportunity to come and present some thoughts that I've been exploring, which are related to infrastructure choices for climate adaptation, and what might make sense as we move forward into an era where we know we have to deal with this, but there's still a great deal of uncertainty about what the impacts are going to be. Before I start, I wanted to acknowledge the very many students that have helped me contribute towards this particular piece of work. There are on the screen about 18 students. They range everywhere from undergraduates to PhD students. And I'd also like to acknowledge the funding support that we've received for this from the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Science Foundation, Con Edison, and also Tectra America. I've got an overview of what I'm going to discuss in the next 40 to 50 minutes. I'm going to start off with a little bit about the climate projections and impacts, which we're all too familiar with at this point in time. Some categories of infrastructure adaptation that are currently being explored, and there are 3 categories which I've sort of self-identified here. And then I'm going to talk about work that I've been doing with colleagues on localized and distributed infrastructure systems as an alternative to the more centralized infrastructure systems that we're generally used to in the global north and that most engineers like myself have been trained to design. I'm going to use New York City as a case study to discuss how localized and distributed infrastructure systems might have some role to play in climate adaptation strategies. And then I've just got one slide that talks about observations and some conclusions that we're beginning to draw in this particular area. All right, so climate change projections and impacts. I think our colleagues in climate science have done a very good job persuading us that we're going to be seeing a rise in global sea levels. We're going to be seeing an increase in the average temperatures that we experience. We're going to see changes in the patterns and amounts of precipitation. We're going to see a decline in snow cover, permafrost, and sea ice, acidification of the oceans, an increase in the frequency, intensity, and duration of extreme events, and also a change in ecosystem characteristics. And the impacts as a result of these changes are going to be affecting our water resources. There are going to be areas of the world where we're seeing excess water resources and areas where we're going to be seeing a decline in water resources. They're clearly going to be impacting the infrastructure and how we operate infrastructure and how we design and think about infrastructure as we go forward into the 21st century. Severe impacts on food supplies, particularly in regions of the world where we rely on rain-fed agriculture, and we're going to be seeing decreases in precipitation and potentially rises in temperature. The health of our ecosystems, and also, of course, the health of humans and our well-being as a species. One of the challenges that we face with these climate change projections, though, in trying to understand the impacts that they might have, and in order to adapt to some of these impacts, we do need to understand them, is the uncertainty that we're seeing in the projections. Here, these are two pretty well-known graphs that came from the EPA website at one time in the past, where we're seeing projections of global sea level rise on the left, anything between 0.6 and 6.5 feet, depending on what emissions scenario pathway we think we're on. And on the right, we're seeing quite significant differences in the projections that we have for rises in global temperature, again, depending on what type of emissions scenario pathway we think we're going to have going forward. And not only do we have uncertainty at a global level as we move further forward into time, we also are actually seeing significant spatial uncertainty when it comes to what's happening at a local level. And on the left-hand side, we have projected sea level rises around the coasts of the US. This is for a high emissions scenario. We're expecting greater impacts on the East Coast and in the Gulf area than on the West Coast. And on the right, we actually have projected temperature changes across the US for both a high and a low emissions scenario. And we're seeing that we have heterogeneity in projected temperature rises with higher than expected temperature rises in the interior of the US than on the coastlines. And if we look at precipitation patterns, we also see a great deal of spatial variability and seasonal variability as well. We're seeing in the north generally increased precipitation expected, and in some areas of the south, decrease in precipitation, which is clearly going to add to water stress that already exists in some of those regions of the United States. So that's a background to discuss what is needed for adaptation. And I've divided the current categories of infrastructure adaptation into three categories. Sometimes these categories are also used to discuss resilience. How do we move forward as a society thinking about resilience strategies? So there is some overlap. But the first broad category I'm calling strategic relocation. So that would be where we think about adaptation that is necessary, particularly in high-risk areas, not so much as buttressing against changes, but in actually relocating our existing infrastructure or populations or limiting new development. And on the left-hand side, we have a picture of a proposal for Toronto in Canada, where they've developed a relocation strategy for some of their old industrial areas along the riverfront. And they're trying to prevent some of the surge that they think the city is going to experience by redesigning that particular area. So they have a relocation strategy that's actually fairly local to their city. And on the right-hand side, there's the locations of some communities in Alaska who are actually thinking of relocating the community full stop. So actually picking up the existing community and taking it to a different location to try and mitigate the impacts of climate that those communities are expecting to face. And this is already happening in some communities around the world. In Fiji, for example, we've already seen a community that's relocated as a climate adaptation strategy. So that's one particular strategy that can be taken for adaptation. A second strategy, which is actually centuries old, is to try and retrofit our existing human settlements to deal with the impacts of climate change. And on the bottom, those of you are probably familiar with this. This is a proposal that was came out of a design competition that New York City ran after Sandy, and it's by the big team. It's the Big U project, and it's a retrofit of the base end of Manhattan to deal with the impacts of rising sea levels and storm surge. And on the top, I'm contrasting it with an old map of Antwerp in the 16th century, where exactly the same strategy was used, a retrofit of a city, a physical wall around the city in this particular case. And this retrofit was to protect the city from military threats. So the retrofitting of cities to deal with threats is actually a strategy that humans have used for centuries, and it's a climate adaptation strategy that's been proposed in many environments where retrofitting is not only physically possible, it's actually also politically and economically possible. The third category that I've called out is redundancy. So this is using backup or temporary systems to try and adapt or mitigate some of the impacts of climate change. Examples that are used quite frequently in Europe are these storm surge barriers, which can, like the Thames barrier, actually be in place and have gates that rise when they're expecting a storm surge up the River Thames. On the bottom right-hand side, there's a temporary structure that can be put in place. And this was something that's proposed for many communities in the UK that have experienced severe flooding in the past few years. So these are sort of like a temporary or a redundant way of dealing with the impacts of storm surge or rising water levels. And on the top, I have an example of something that is used quite frequently in Chicago during the summer months, when they're experiencing extreme heat. And we know one of the impacts of climate change is going to be an increase in the urban heat island effects that are taking place in our urban environments, and this is a cooling center. So it's another example of a temporary or a backup system that's trying to deal with the impacts of climate change, so an adaptation strategy. All right, so what are the challenges that are associated with these strategies and other strategies that we might think about for climate adaptation? The first is something that I called out when we were looking initially at impacts of climate change, and that's the uncertainty in global climate change projections. It's very difficult to come up with an intervention, particularly a physical intervention, something that involves an infrastructure design or an infrastructure solution to this if you actually don't know specifically what you're designing for. So we think about the global sea level rise projections, anything between 0.6 and 6.5 feet. As an engineer, it's very challenging to know what to do. What height barrier are you going to put up? Even if it's a temporary structure, what are you going to design as a support system underground for that temporary structure? I mean, you need to have some certainty, or at least a reasonable amount of certainty to move forward with designs. The other challenge we face is that there is a need for locally specific data. And at present, many of the climate change projections are at scales that are not necessarily small enough to deal with the local specificity that's required for design. So you might have an idea of sea level rise along the eastern seaboard, but you might not necessarily know what to expect in Charleston, for example. So our colleagues in climate science not only need to help and work with other communities in reducing uncertainty at global projections, they also need to be able to get a little bit more specific about what's happening locally in order to move some of these adaptation strategies forward. We also need to be able to translate the local specific data when it's available into risk, and we need to develop approaches to mitigate that risk that are technically feasible and probably a little bit more challenging, both politically and economically feasible. So I'm now going to move on to a discussion about localized and distributed infrastructure systems. So this is a global movement that's been happening both in the global north and the global south. And it's a movement away from more traditional centralized infrastructure systems that are often used to provide the services that we need in our human settlements. So let me give you one example of a centralized system. It might be a nuclear power plant that is providing energy to a community at a very large scale. A decentralized system, on the other hand, might be a solar panel that is only providing energy quite locally. If you contrast the two, the number of solar panels that you need to provide the energy that a nuclear power plant will provide is quite large, and that's why we call them sort of distributed systems. the sort of the more localized systems need to be distributed over quite a large spatial area in order to provide the same services generally as a centralized system. Now, in the global north, there's been a lot of interest in localized or distributed systems because a lot of the infrastructure that we have in the global north is aging. It hasn't been maintained correctly. There haven't been the resources in it put into it to keep it up to the operational standards for which it was designed, but also with the population increase, particularly in migrations towards urban areas, a lot of our infrastructure systems weren't even designed for the capacity that they now have to meet. So the localized or distributed systems are seen as potential systems that can supplement our centralized systems and provide us with the services that we actually do require to meet the standard of living that we're currently used to. Now, in the Global South, it's a very different story, because in the Global South, particularly in urban areas, we've seen settlements moving ahead of planning. So we have a lot of informal settlements that are now housing significant fractions of the population in the Global South, and they have no infrastructure at all. So in those particular settings, it's not going to be possible to insert into the fabric of those dense settlements the type of centralized infrastructure services that we're used to in the global north. So the decentralized systems are probably going to be one of the few choices that they have. So both in the global north and in the global south, there's been a real interest in moving towards the design, build and operation of these localized, decentralized systems. So I'm part of a sustainability research network that's funded by the National Science Foundation, that's actually looking at whether these localized or distributed infrastructure systems are more sustainable. And I think in some settings they might be an option, in other settings they won't. So there's not a preconceived notion among the researchers in this network, which spans 9 universities, that they're better or worse than centralized systems. We're just exploring the question. And we're looking at whether they improve environmental outcomes, health outcomes of population, and the well-being of population, or whether in fact they detract from the environment, health, and well-being. And we're taking a multi-infrastructure perspective. So we're looking at 7 common infrastructure sectors that are generally used to provide services to populations. And the lead of this sustainability research network is Anu Ramaswamy at the University of Minnesota. And so it's within this context of looking at the environmental sustainability, health, and well-being of these distributed, decentralized systems that I started to think about their role in climate adaptation. Just to give you an example of some of these local and distributed systems, we've already mentioned that solar panel is an example of a localized or distributed energy system. They can be at the individual household level, or some communities, there are like solar farms at the community level, or microgrids are popping up in various urban areas. Rainwater harvesting is another example of a decentralized system that can be used to provide water supply locally. On the sort of the bottom middle picture here, this is actually a carbon water filter. This can actually provide decentralized wastewater treatment services. And the Solaire building in downtown New York actually has a system like this in the basement. It's a multi-story condo building, and they can treat all of their wastewater on site. So they don't necessarily have to rely on the centralized wastewater treatment plants in New York City. And on the right-hand side, this is another example of a sort of a decentralized system that's sort of gaining popularity, which is like urban farming. So not necessarily relying on the global food system, which most of New York relies for its actually food supply, but can you grow food locally? And this is a rooftop farm in Brooklyn on an old warehouse building. So there are some examples of these localized distributed systems. So the research network is looking at what is the best mix of local versus non-local. And there's a diagram here, a matrix, that is explaining the various mixes that are possible. The extreme would be fully localized. So that would be, if we take energy as an example, within your city boundary, if we think of the urban scale as a boundary that we're interested in, but the boundary can be obviously drawn at multiple scales, you would be able to meet all of your energy needs through either solar panels on rooftops or sort of microgrids or solar farms. So that would be a fully localized system. And then a fully external system at the bottom is where you're actually meeting none of your energy needs, taking the energy sector as one of our example infrastructure sectors here. Within the city boundary, and all of your needs are actually being met from a more centralized system, which is providing you energy through the grid. And a partially localized system is where you're actually meeting some of your needs through these decentralized systems, and some of your needs externally. And when we're talking about decentralized and centralized, I want to just clarify at this point, we're talking about it from a material perspective, because I'm going to come back to how these systems actually sometimes do require some form of centralization, and probably at the virtual level. So this particular focus on centralized versus decentralized for the purpose of this talk, and also the research network, is from a material perspective. Something else that we're quite interested in when it comes to the operation of these new forms of civil infrastructure is their governance. So let's imagine that you have a system that is now comprised of thousands and thousands of components versus one centralized component. There's a question of who is in charge of financing it, operating and managing it, and who's in charge of regulating it. And again, there's sort of different extremes that we could have here. We could have somebody's in charge of personally financing it, an informal regulation system that they decide upon, and basically dealing with the operation and maintenance themselves, all the way to a decentralized system that could actually have a collective finance and governance. So there's sort of two components that the research network is looking at. And I'm going to come back to some work. I just have one slide that one of my colleagues, Rick Fayek, has done in this area, and tried to identify under which governance systems are you most likely to get these decentralized infrastructures coming into play. All right, so I said that it was my engagement with this particular research network that made me start to think about whether these localized and distributed systems actually have some role to play in climate adaptation. Now, unlike a larger intervention, for example, the big U at the end of Manhattan, or go back to the wall around Antwerp, or even a storm surge barrier like the Thames barrier in London, these systems are a lot more flexible, in the sense that you're not necessarily locking into a certain type of configuration or a certain number of components, or even a certain type of performance up front. You can start to insert these systems into fabrics, for example, urban fabrics, over time. As you're inserting them into urban fabrics over time and you want to change their performance, you can start to insert new designs into the urban fabric. You can concentrate in one area where you think you're vulnerable and find out that in actual fact you're not vulnerable, and you can move to another area. So they offer a great deal of flexibility. So the spatial configuration and the spatial design can develop over time, but then so can the financing. So it can sort of be almost like a bottoms-up strategy in some case, or something that's deliberately planned in another case. But the financing doesn't necessarily also have to occur over what would be considered a fairly short period of time in many situations. The other thing about them is they have co-benefits. And the case study that we're going to look at in New York City, the decentralized system that we examined, which was a green infrastructure system, was not inserted into the city fabric because it offered some benefit to climate adaptation. It was inserted into the city fabric to deal with stormwater management issues. And so these systems are not necessarily just available for climate adaptation, that they have other benefits to them. So I'm going to move on to the case study in New York City, which is also going to uncover that there are challenges associated with this approach, as there will be with any approach to climate adaptation. All right, so as I mentioned, the case study in New York City, we're going to be looking at green infrastructure. New York City's been quite aggressive as an urban area moving into a green infrastructure program. In fact, they're hoping to invest over $2 billion over the next 20 years in inserting green infrastructure into the urban fabric. Their motivation is not climate adaptation, although there is more interest now at the city level in the role of this type of infrastructure in climate adaptation and or resilience. But their motivation comes from the massive change in the hydrological cycle that we've experienced in urban areas as we've built them up and we've introduced more and more hardscape. And so this is a cartoon that's illustrating the hydrological cycle in a pre-development landscape where we have rainfall coming into the pre-development landscape, and we would expect 40% of it to go back into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. We would expect about 50% of it to soak into the underground and recharge the shallow and the deep aquifers in the area. And we'd only expect 10% of it to run across the surface and then recharge the local water bodies. Now, what's happened in our urban landscapes, and this is an aerial photograph of the Gowanus Canal area, if any of you are familiar with that, in Brooklyn, is that we've introduced a lot of impervious surface, and of course we've reduced the amount of vegetation that you would expect in a pre-development landscape. And as a result, when rainfall lands in an urban landscape, only 30% of it goes back into the atmosphere as evapotranspiration, and that's what's leading to urban heat island effects. We don't have the cooling of evapotranspiration in our urban areas. Only 15% of it can soak below the ground surface and recharge the subsurface systems because of the amount of impervious surface that we have in our urban environments, and 55% of it runs off. So what used to be a small amount of runoff has become quite a large fraction of runoff, and that's created a waste disposal problem. So clean water in the form of precipitation is now something that urban areas have to deal with as a waste. It's stormwater. Now, so what happens when it rains a lot in cities like New York is that the sanitary sewage from the local buildings, as well as the rainwater, which runs off the impervious hardscape, make their way into either a single pipe system, and this is ubiquitous in New York, or a separate pipe system. And there are some areas of New York where we have the separate pipe system, but mainly we have the single pipe system. The single pipe system is fairly common in most of our older cities across the States and in Europe, and even in areas like Melbourne, Australia. The single pipe system was not designed to carry the amount of sewage and rainwater that it now has to carry. And when we have twice what is called the dry weather flow, and that's just the flow in the single pipe system that comes from the sewage, the sanitary sewage from the city's buildings, there are little weirs in the pipe system that allow any excess flow to go out into the local water bodies, and this is called a combined sewer event. In New York City, there are 500 permitted outfalls around the city where during wet weather flow, we get a combination of the stormwater and the combined sewage going into the Hudson River, the East River, the Gowanus Canal, multiple areas around the city. Now, even in the single pipe system, there are issues. Although you don't necessarily have the sanitary sewage going into the local water bodies with the single pipe system, you get any contamination that the stormwater picks up along the way going into the single pipe system, and it's often not treated before it goes into the local water bodies. So you get pollutants going into the local water bodies. You also get trash on the street that's picked up and goes out of the end of the single pipe system, and that contributes to things like the trash patch, which exists, one of the trash patches which exists in the Atlantic Ocean. So these are two consequences. This contamination of the local water body and the decreased evapotranspiration in the urban environment are two consequences of the built-up nature of our urban landscapes. Now, clearly, it's not legal to discharge sanitary sewage or other waste into local water bodies. So New York City, like many other cities that have this problem, are under consent decree to do something about it. This is enacted through the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York City, which is acting on the authority of the Environmental Protection Agency. So what New York City has decided to do, and many other cities like it, is to try and restore that pre-development hydrological cycle. So to reduce the runoff and to increase the evapotranspiration, which is a co-benefit of this, by reintroducing vegetation back into the city's hardscape. And they're reintroducing vegetation through engineered infrastructure that we call green infrastructure. And as I mentioned, they're estimating that this will be at a cost of about $2.4 billion, 20 years. The city is responsible for about $1.5 billion of that. The rest needs to come from some type of private partnership. And the particular design goal of the New York City's green infrastructure plan is eliminate the first inch of runoff from 10% of New York City's impervious area. Those of us who are interested in this and have been researching and monitoring the performance of these green infrastructures are not quite sure where that design goal came from. But it's basically trying to reduce a certain amount of combined sewer overflow. Now, at the same time as having this issue with combined sewer overflow, or in the separate pipe system, other contaminants and possibly trash washing into the city's water body, New York City is also expected to be experiencing an increase in precipitation over time. The projections in the table are provided by some of my colleagues who are climate scientists at New York City. And so the problem with the combined sewer overflow, if it's not dealt with, is only going to get worse. And the problem, if we deal with it now, is that we haven't dealt with it for the future, because we're getting this increased precipitation, but we're also expecting to be getting increased temperatures in the city. So we already experience an urban heat island effect, and we're expecting that the temperatures are going to be rising even higher as we move forward into the 21st century. But of course, we don't know exactly by how much, because we don't know what global emissions scenario that we're on. But we do know that we're going to have increased precipitation and increased temperatures, among other impacts in the city, which means that the flooding that we already experienced during some wet weather events was extremely disruptive to the city is only going to get worse. And the urban heat island, which is shown as the red area on the map to the right, is only going to increase. So there's an opportunity here, not only for the green infrastructure to deal with the combined sewer overflow event, but there's also an opportunity for it to help deal with some of the impacts of increased precipitation and flooding that we're experiencing in the city, and to help cool our urban environment, so to help deal with some of the impacts of increased temperature, which are going to have severe health impacts, particularly for vulnerable members of our population, for example, the urban elderly poor folk. All right, so here are some example green infrastructure strategies that are being inserted into New York City's hardscape, and which myself and a large number of other researchers at Columbia University have been studying. There's green roofs. I'm trying to get the cursor. This is actually a green roof on a Columbia University property. They soak up the rainfall that literally just falls on their watershed area. There's green streets, where there's an opportunity to bump something out of the sidewalk because the roadway is wide enough. New York's been putting these little strategies in. And again, they actually soak up just the rainfall that falls on them. There's the urban forest, tree canopies and vines, which intercept rainfall and have a very complicated hydrological response, which involves interception, stem flow, and also is impacted by how much the tree pit can soak up the rainfall. We've been studying these as well as the canopies. And this is something that the city's moving quite aggressively on. And these are rain gardens. They used to be called right-of-way bioswales, but because that was not something that most of the public understood as a term, they started to call them rain gardens. And these actually channel water from the nearby impervious areas into them, and then they soak up through the vegetation that's planted. And we estimate that they can probably deal with about rainfall that falls on about 100 times their size. Now, the city's inserted about 4,500 to 5,000 of these into the city landscape right now. The reason that these are popular is because they sit in the public right-of-way. So working with the Department of Transportation and other departments in the city somewhat has the right to insert these into a neighborhood without necessarily having to get permission from anybody outside the city's authority. Now, the only way you can protest if one is coming your way is if there's some ADA reason, and maybe this is something that's going to be disrupting the way that you exit a car, for example, and get into your home. And we're gonna come back to this, but right now this is one of the strategies that they're aggressively moving forward with. So we've actually developed for all of these green infrastructure strategies design curves that could be used to tell us how they might perform going into the future if we had accurate information on climate projections. So we can say how much stormwater they will soak up now, and with a change in the input to our models, we can say how much stormwater they would soak up in the future. And I'm not going to go into any details about the technicalities of the measurements that we made or the models that we developed for this, but we've been monitoring these infrastructures, in some cases the green roofs, for maybe 5 or 6 years now. So we actually have a very robust data set. We've also been monitoring their evapotranspiration performance, and we've developed models that can link temperature and relative humidity to evapotranspiration, which with climate science impacts, we could actually look at cooling impacts of these strategies. One of my colleagues, Stuart Gaffin at NASA Goddard, has been actually trying to understand their local cooling impacts. This is images on the right from an infrared temperature camera, which tells you the significant reduction in surface temperature that vegetation introduces into the city. But it doesn't tell you the reduction in air temperature. And of course, it's the air temperature that we need to understand in order to understand the scale of intervention of these type of infrastructures that would be needed to mitigate climate impacts or adapt to climate impacts that are a result of rising temperatures. We've even measured how much CO2 they sequester, which is sort of more like a mitigation impact, but they do, over a diurnal cycle, sequester a little bit of CO2. So going back to the climate adaptation story, is this a vision for New York City? I mean, could we restore New York City to its pre-development landscape? And on the bottom right is a rendering of what somebody imagines a ubiquitous program to introduce green roofs across the city might look like. But there's a significant fraction, 40% of the hardscape of the city is rooftop. So there's a significant opportunity with this fallow area to actually do something about it. But could you actually make a serious dent in dealing with New York City's flooding and temperature increases as a result of climate change by a strategy like this, which is more distributed than the big U strategy that's being proposed for some of the flooding at the end of the city? All right, so there are definitely some challenges related to this, which we've learned through the years of engaging in the green infrastructure program, primarily for stormwater management. And that is the scale of the implementation that is needed. So that goes back to some of the challenges that the other climate adaptation strategies are facing, which are not just technical, but they're economic, although this could be spread over a longer period of time, and they're also political. The city has found with the stormwater management program, which would be at a smaller scale than anything needed for climate adaptation, that they need public-private partnerships. That's been a real challenge for the City of New York, and I'm happy to take questions on that if anyone is interested, but they can't even meet the stormwater management goals that they're trying to meet with their strategies on the public right-of-way. So there would have to be some there'd have to be some private buy-in for a strategy like this, or new zoning or planning policies. Siting requirements are something. These infrastructures can't be sited everywhere, so there are some limitations spatially for how they would go, and maybe those limitations put you in zones where they're not as helpful as they might be. But something that we've found that many cities in this, working in this area haven't thought about when it comes to the distributed infrastructure systems is the maintenance requirements. It's very different maintaining a centralized system, including security concerns that you might have, than maintaining a system that it comprises of thousands and thousands of components. And so the city's finding, even with its green infrastructure program, at the scale that it is right now, that they need an increased workforce. They need to think about stewardship. These are in the public right-of-way. As an engineer, that's quite interesting, actually, designing something that sits in the public right-of-way, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. But can you engage the public in maintaining some of these infrastructures? And something that I've been quite interested in is trying to understand the performance of these distributed infrastructure systems as a system and not as an individual component. Most of the monitoring and the prediction and the research that's gone on in this area has been as an individual component. How does a green roof perform? How does a rain garden perform? How do they perform as a system is what we really want to know. And it might be necessary to understand how they perform as a system to actually monitor a significant number of them. So there needs to be some type of low-cost monitoring technology. And then we really don't know the long-term performance of these systems because they're sort of new, even though they're getting global traction. How they perform on multiple levels, not just from an engineering perspective, but how do we govern them long-term, et cetera, is not well known. So the next slide, I'm going to talk about the interesting thing about infrastructure that interfaces more with the public. And I think these distributed systems, decentralized systems by nature, are going to be that, whether it's a solar panel on a roof, a bioswale outside your house, a rainwater harvesting system on a couple of roofs. They're not engineered systems that are tucked away neatly and are controlled by those in charge of operation and maintenance. So here's a lady in Queens that's not thrilled to get a rain garden in her neighborhood. And she's not thrilled because she says that people throw trash in them, which is true, people do throw trash in them. She thinks they attract mosquitoes. They're actually designed to be very well draining, so they really shouldn't attract mosquitoes. She's convinced they attract rats, and they might actually, because rats actually like to hide under vegetation as they move around the city, so it's possible, that's possibly a reasonable claim. And it's, by the way, it's taken away her parking spot. These are valid concerns, and something that's been quite interesting about the New York City Green Infrastructure Program, even though there's been a lot of discussion at community board levels, and if you're going to receive one of these on the pavement outside your home, you do actually get a notice, although you really don't get much choice about whether you want it or not, unless there are extenuating circumstances, is this disconnect between what a city wants to do to move its infrastructure forward and communication with the public and public buy-in about this being the right way to move the infrastructure forward. And from an engineering perspective, the way these perform actually is modified by the way the public interacts with them. So people will take the plants out. People will put trash in them. People will vandalize them. And so their performance changes as an interaction with the public. They're also living systems, so the performance changes as the vegetation actually changes over time. So So from that perspective, it's a very new engineering design. So public living systems are not something that many engineers, at least when I was doing my undergraduate degree, are taught to design. The other thing that we found that was quite interesting when we did an expert survey, a stakeholder survey, was that if you look at greenery in general as an intervention possibly for climate adaptation in cities, and you look at the services the green water provides, and we use the UN Millennium Ecosystem Services Framework to look at this. The provisioning services, which is generally why they were designed, are not ranked as highly as the cultural and social services. So we actually found when you look at reintroducing vegetation back into urban landscapes, whether it's for stormwater management or potentially climate adaptation, the services that you're trying to have this infrastructure provide are not the services that the public values. So there's also a disconnect here between the way that we're going about designing and how we might design to tap into the fact that the public probably values the cultural and social services more than the services that might be related to stormwater management and climate adaptation. Finally, this is something from my colleague Rick Fyok, who's been looking at what circumstances would allow municipalities, urban areas, or other communities move forward with distributed infrastructure services, maybe in the north to buttress centralized systems that are failing, or maybe as a climate adaptation strategy. And he's found, not surprisingly, this community and stakeholder engagement is key for success, coordination and integration within the city itself, because these infrastructures require coordination across multiple agencies, and of course the fiscal capacity. So these are sort of governance pillars that are necessary for success if this were to be an adaptation strategy. And I've just got a couple more slides. Some of the design considerations that I've touched upon are to do with the fact that the systems have very, very many components. How do they perform under those circumstances is not known, but how do we define performance is also not known. So as engineers, we're used to putting factors of safety on everything. So if I have a seawall, and that's a climate adaptation strategy, and I think sea level rise is a meter, I put a factor of safety on that. But the system that has very many components, it's not clear where you would put the factor of safety. Do I put twice as many components in? Do I design each to perform twice as well? So there are just really basic engineering questions about design that are still to be sorted out here. We talked about monitoring the performance and then maintaining them, because if they're interfacing with the public and they're living systems, their performance is going to change over time, which is also quite interesting. And I've got here a big data cloud, because some of the answers in this area, which we've seen in infrastructure systems that are to do with energy, solar panels, for example, you've ended up with entities coming in and monitoring each component individually, collecting those data centrally in a cloud, and then trying to understand maintenance based on individual data points and also collective performance. So we might be moving into a decentralized physical system, but it might have to use a centralized virtual system in order to be effective for what we want to design it for. And there's a big question in my mind when we start thinking about governance, city governance, and big data, like who owns the data? And what I put here was something that's sort of interested me quite a lot at the time, which was IBM's involvement with the city of Rio when it came to the Olympics. So suddenly you have a private entity that's moving into a city, an important city function, and the question of who owns the data, who gets to control the data. Is it something that's publicly accessible, or is it something that private? I think is, in general, a fairly big question, and it might be a question if these distributed systems end up being part of an adaptation strategy. All right, so these are my final slide observations and conclusions. I do think there's a role for these type of infrastructure systems in climate Adaptation, obviously there's a role for the other type of infrastructure interventions that I introduced at the beginning. In some cases, the strategic relocation is going to be essential. In some cases, we are going to have to retrofit our human settlements, and we are going to have backup systems. But I think these flexible modular systems that can sort of evolve over time as the uncertainty and climate change projections reduce over time also has a role to play. But there are issues about how we actually design these, at what scale they need to be implemented to be successful, how we're going to maintain them. I think there's a big question about monitoring, and if we go to a centralized system for monitoring, there's a question about who owns that data. There are governance questions, particularly with respect to stakeholder engagement, and there are societal questions. We saw with the green infrastructure what it was designed for, and what other functions it could form were not what it was valued for. There's a disconnect there. Then finally, I want to say there's questions involving equity. And this has been quite interesting how it's played out in New York City. So one of the areas that was hardest hit, the area sort of Chelsea, Battery Park City, all that area, we're seeing massive real estate development continuing in that area, despite the vulnerability to sea level rise and storm surge. And we're seeing the real estate development or the real estate developers almost climate proofing their buildings to the extent that's possible because they can afford to. Building bathtubs, putting services up top, having backup systems. Not everybody can afford to do that. So that to me is almost like a localized distributed adaptation strategy to a building, another form of infrastructure, sort of building by building. On the question of solar energy, and this isn't a climate adaptation example, but we're also seeing people that can afford to go off the grid in some areas because they can afford to purchase solar panels or take out loans, doing so and being able to sell that power back to the centralized system. So they're doubly benefiting. They're becoming less reliant on the centralized system, and in some cases they're actually able to make money on the centralized system. But somebody still has to pay for the centralized system. And so the burden on the centralized system is going to increasingly fall if we continue along this pathway in some communities on those that can't afford the solar panels. So I think there's also an equity issue, particularly with the way that some of these decentralized systems are playing out. At least in the global north, maybe less so in the global south. And finally, this is a question I just, which is another reason why I started to think about these sort of more flexible systems. I just don't know how feasible some of the long-term strategies like the giant walls are in a short-term political world. And maybe these small flexible systems offer a pathway forward, at least to start along the pathway that we need to go. That's my final slide. Thank you.
Time for a few questions.
Yes.
So I have two questions. The first is you didn't actually give us your result on what if you did have 40% rooftop cover. What effects would that have on your goals in New York? So that would be an extreme example. And then my second question is broader. In general, we haven't had so many decentralized systems because of the cost, because you have economies of scale, because you have added management costs. But now, of course, we have a whole range of new technologies potentially available, but they're going to be specific to different tasks. So how much are newer technologies changing these costs? And if you had, for example, proper management, maintenance, could you do decentralized sewage treatment at the same cost as you do centralized sewage treatment instead of centralized?
Yeah, okay, so I think we estimated with Sandy we could have managed 10%. That's with existing, not with the extreme. I mean, the extreme I don't think is probably feasible, but the question about the extreme we're actually trying to answer now. It's taken us 2 years to build a GIS layer that has every single piece of greenery in New York City in it right now, all the way down to the tree pits. So we're now with the models that we've developed for the individual GI, and with this map of total greenery, we're probably at a point where we could answer that question. But yeah, the technology thing, I think the big technological advances are going to be in monitoring. And I think if you're remotely monitoring a system, the maintenance costs can be actually quite efficient. So I think that's what's going to step it forward. And on some of the actual physical, so we know that solar panels now are almost at a parity with some other options for energy supply. So as the uptake increases, the price is going to go down. And I think at least with the solar panel example, we're going to see parity.
What about sewage treatment? I've always been curious.
Yeah, so the Solaire folk, I met the guy that designed the Solaire system, and he said the sewage charges were so low in New York City that it would be 40 years payback for that system. But that's sort of tied to so in New York City, the stormwater sewage fee does not anywhere near come close to the cost of treating. They basically right now just charge you for your water consumption, which is a little bit nonsensical, because if you're in a pancake building, like a Home Depot, you're not going to use much water, but you're generating a massive amount of stormwater, which goes into the sewerage with a double pipe system. So the conclusion that he came to was it's not feasible with the current charges. It is feasible if we start to charge what it costs. And so it's also geographically sensitive. And in New York City, they could actually drink that water, but they're not allowed to. So it's a public health.
You know, we've had package plants for new developments all over New Jersey, for example, and elsewhere, and they failed. So the reason, environmentalists became opposed to the use of kind of decentralized sewage treatment, because they'd be thrown up by a local developer and they wouldn't be properly maintained. So it's a kind of, for me, it's an interesting question. The real question is, if we had to build a new sewage treatment plant, what would be cheaper, and could you actually do that?
I mean, I think this technology and the water technology, the clean water technology, is going to disrupt this. And I think the systems you're talking about were septic systems.
No,
they had the granular active carbon system. Yeah.
They weren't even in the ground. They're just literally
like a package.
Tank systems all over the place, and they generally fail. But that doesn't mean by any means you couldn't do a better system. Just
sorry.
Yeah, I noticed that your gardens are all horizontal. Have you looked at all at vertical gardens? I've seen buildings where gardens cover the whole side of the building. And it would seem to me that a lot of buildings with brick sides could provide a lot of, it's unused space.
Yeah, I think you're correct. And I think the other thing that the vertical walls, the vertical green walls provide is much more efficient air quality improvement, because the tree canopies tend to trap it. And then we've done some studies of the vertical, and they will trap some, but I think it comes undone. So I think the vertical walls. So the vine canopy studies that we did were related to that. But so we've done some controlled experiments, but the only vertical green walls besides ivy that I'm aware of in New York City actually exist interior. Like the Lincoln Center has a nice one.
With these buildings that I saw were external.
No, absolutely. There are buildings that have external vertical walls, and the system that works the most isn't like a green wall. It's actually you put up a trellis next to the building wall, and you actually allow a vine to establish itself on the trellis. So it's like you have another wall next to the building wall, and because it's very damaging to the building to actually have the vines on the building face itself. But yeah, I don't. It's definitely something that would be a huge benefit. It's a question, I assume, of aesthetics, building zoning. But it's not been widely uptaken in New York for certain.
There's a lot of interest in white roofs for reflection to reduce the cooling load. Is there a competition between whether you use your roof for green or for white, and people looked at the comparable benefits?
Yes, there is. There's a competition between whether you use it for green roofs, white roofs, or solar panels. So there's or rainwater harvesting. So one of my colleagues, Stuart Gaffin, has studied the white versus the green roofs. Now, one of the challenges in New York City is the white roofs get dirty very easily. And also, frankly, as a human being, it's harder to look out on what would be an Arctic landscape than a green landscape. So there are aesthetic advantages to the green roofs, and of course, the white roofs are just dealing with the albedo effect, and the green roofs actually do ET. So for cooling, they're definitely better, I would say. But they're obviously more costly and more maintenance associated with them. Yes.
And was there a result with respect to competition for solar?
Yeah, so it turns out they can be co-located. So the cooling effect that the green roof provides makes the solar panels more efficient.
So you have solar panels and then green roofs underneath them?
Yeah, yeah. But it's feasible to do both.
Sounds complicated. Has anyone actually done that? I've never seen.
There's a school in New York City that's actually I think it's called the Bronx Construction Academy. They're in South Bronx, and they won an international competition demonstrating that was the case. And I've seen also some, I want to say it's grey literature, but some work that Carrier produced a while ago that actually also demonstrated that if you pull an HVAC system across a green roof, you can save energy too, because you're pulling cooler air in. So that energy-water nexus is something that works out in this area.
But if you place the green underneath the solar panel, then the green doesn't get the light, or not? Or
Yeah, it's a function of how you space them. No, you're not covering the whole roof. You're spacing it. And then they can tilt as well, the solar panels.
I'm sorry, what can?
The solar panels can tilt. You'd want them to track the sun to be most effective. But we have a lot of experiments trying to look at that issue. I mean, New York City is fascinating from the perspective of a living lab. So we have rain shadowing going on. So we have rain gauges on roofs that are just a few blocks apart, and one will get 70% less precipitation simply because of rain shadowing. And then they're in the shade most of the day, the plants. So it's a function of the plant type. People like desert succulents because they seem to actually be able to withstand pretty dire conditions on a rooftop, including not enough sunlight. It's a CAM plant, if that means anything. You had a question?
I was wondering, you're talking about the green infrastructure effect in terms of adaptation due to rainfall flooding. But in terms of storm surge and sea level rise, it's a amount of water coming as flooding. I'm wondering how this infrastructure system could help. Or you mentioned you did analysis of Sandy. Do you mean?
We mean flooding. We mean the flooding. Yes.
The rainfall flooding rather than the storm.
Yeah, or Irene was the same issue. Yeah, the storm surge solution in this space, if you want to call it green infrastructure, is the wetland, the tidal wetlands.
Wetlands may only reduce some of the wave impact.
Exactly.
Difficult to reduce the amount of flooding actually produced by storms.
Yeah, it would reduce the energy. Yeah.
So does that mean in this case we still need to centralize the solution, like the wall and the barrier?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't think in this particular case, the green in the flooding case, the green infrastructure would be the solution for storm surge, but it doesn't mean that there couldn't be a more modular system that was in place other than a wall.
Yeah, I mean for residential houses
Uh-huh.
distributed systems. But for this carbon, it's like this individual solution is also.
I mean, what they started to do with some of the new developments that they put up after Sandy was underground. There's a band, and you just pull the gate up. So the bottom of the building is first you don't put any of your centralized infrastructure there. So that's moved up top, but you can flood-proof just the bottom story of the building, to the extent that it's possible. But if it gets flooded, the damage is not severe. I mean, the sort of the distributed building situation is what I'm saying is going on in some areas south of Manhattan. But that's a very expensive system. The strategic relocation might be a better option there.
Maybe last question. Do you have a sense of at what height of sea level rise do you lose the ability to do some of those bottom floor? I mean, if we get 10 feet of sea level rise in the next century, which would be the most extreme of any of the predictions that I've heard so far, can you actually do those kinds of ground systems? I mean, ground floor protection systems, or is that just more than can be addressed?
I mean, I suppose it would. I mean, first, I mean, there's a physical question about the energy of the surge, isn't there? Like physically, I mean, these are not robust systems necessarily. So, how much energy can they actually take as impact before they're no longer efficient physically? I mean, there's the height question. I mean, 10 feet would be high for one of those temporary barriers, is my feeling. But I think one of the biggest concerns, if we go back to southern Manhattan, is the underground infrastructure at this point, though. So there's this great, has anyone seen this great picture of Goldman Sachs before Sandy? They sandbagged the building. Anyone see it? And somebody said to me, it's not sand, it's money. So they kept dry. And then the next day the lights are on, and there's no one home because the subway's down. None of the schools are open. You know, everyone else is in the dark because they didn't sandbag their building, so they're trying to deal with their own personal situation at home. So I don't, you know, I guess I'm saying I think it's the answer's quite complicated because it's not just your own personal infrastructure, it's basically the infrastructure and services that you rely on. And I think Lower Manhattan's very vulnerable to the underground infrastructure. In fact, you know, some of it still hasn't recovered. And I think more salt water down there is just not going to help that system. It's pretty dire shape as it is day to day, the MTA. So
On that positive note,
I'm sorry.
Thank you.